Good morning, and welcome to United States Air Force Academy's Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell webinar on Executive Order 14028, Improving the Nation's Cybersecurity. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Timothy Goines, the co-director of the Research Cell, and along with Professor Jeff Biller, my fellow co-director, we are your presenters. A few administrative matters before we begin. First, as many of you know, we host monthly webinars on space law. Our next webinar in that series will be on 28 July 2021. Dr. PJ Blount will be giving a presentation with the working title, Cybersecurity and Outer Space Law. So mark your calendars for that one. Second, if you have not connected with us on LinkedIn or Twitter or YouTube, I'd encourage you to do so. All the videos, including this one, will be put on YouTube shortly after the presentation. And you'll be sure to receive the latest of our information on the webinars that we're doing, along with our various other initiatives of the Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell. Finally, for those of you who are interested in applying for CLE credit for this presentation, you should have received the Uniform Certificate of Attendance in the email yesterday. If you have not received it and would like it, please email us at Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell, or LTWRC@usafa.edu. And you can use that email for any other questions or concerns that you have related to this presentation, future presentations if you're interested in presenting, or any of our other initiatives. Turning to today's topic, this is our first in our cyber law series. We wanted to start here with this topic because it was a very important first big step the federal government took in attempting to better secure the cyber infrastructure against malicious actors. The presentation will essentially have two parts. The first part, I will begin by discussing the impetus for the executive order, namely the Sunburst hack. And then Professor Biller will take over for the second half, discussing the particular requirements of the executive order. As we go through the material, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to ask those in the Q&A. We will be sure to leave time at the end for some questions. Now, before we begin with the actual Sunburst hack, it's helpful for us just to remind ourselves, what is an executive order? Well, executive order are mandates for executive agencies. It's done by the president, and he issues them, or she issues them, for each of the executive agencies. So think three-letter organizations, DoD, Department of Energy, Department of State. And the mandates are requirements that they actually have to comply with. It also conveys policy direction, which we'll talk a little bit more in just a second. But it must have, it's limited. They seem like they're exceedingly powerful, but they are all limited by the scope of the executive authority for all those executive agencies. Congress gives some of its authority to those executive agencies, and when it does so, that's wonderful, but these executive orders are limited to that scope. They cannot contradict legislation, so when it comes to the authority, legislation always supersedes executive orders. But it does signal policy intent to Congress. So this is very important for the president. It's a wonderful tool that he has or she has to signal policy intent to Congress and other federal government agencies or non-federal agencies on where he thinks the direction of certain initiatives should go. Examples of executive orders that many people are probably familiar with: Executive Order 12333, that's the executive order on intelligence activities, and Executive Order 14026, which was the recent one, increasing the minimum wage for federal contractors. Now, why did President Biden decide this was the time to issue this particular executive order? And the answer is Sunburst, also known as SolarWinds. Many people probably have heard of it as SolarWinds. The Sunburst began as early as September 2019, although we're not exactly sure. There's varying reports of how early it really began. I read a recent report just this week that they actually believe it began a year earlier, but we're not sure. And it continued until June 2020. Now, it didn't hit the news until December of 2020, but that's when they actually discovered it and started closing the security gap. It infiltrated over 100 organizations, including the Department of Homeland Security, the Treasury Department, and a number of private corporations, including Intel and Microsoft, in 8 different countries. So it was pretty widespread, and you'll see in just a second, that is just a fraction of what could have been. It was largely an intelligence gathering operation. They gathered emails and files. Many people think of hacks as always those things that are going to shut down certain things. For example, the Colonial Pipeline hack, to disrupt or destroy. But this was an example of very meticulous, you'll see in just a second, very sophisticated restraint in just gathering files and emails for later use. Many have attributed to the Russian intelligence organization, or various ones. However, we're not quite sure. A number of other places have actually attributed to different places, including China. That said, Sunburst is a latest example of a trend that continues to increase of what we call software supply chain hacks, and we'll get into that in just a second, by state-affiliated hacking groups. And as I said before, it's a highly sophisticated attack. It demonstrates restraint. They weren't trying to be discovered. They were trying to just collect a lot of information, and they were very disciplined in that, and very disciplined in covering their tracks, and they were very disciplined in making sure that they kept everything that they did very secure so they would avoid being discovered. So how did Sunburst actually work? Well, as I said, it was a software supply chain operation. What does that mean? Well, supply chain for software is also known as software development, and it's a lengthy process. You're probably familiar with the beta testing process. Well, the beta testing process is actually step 3 in the 4-step process. You have design, you have implementation, and you have testing, and finally deployment. It's a long process. And so if you're able to enter the development process, if an operator is able to enter the development process and create a backdoor in that development process, oftentimes it will carry all the way to deployment. And so seemingly the developer believes that they have created a secure product. The customer believes they have a secure product. Unbeknownst to them, there is actually a security gap. The primary vector is SolarWinds, and that's where it got its name. That's where people most heard of it. It was actually called Sunburst, but the primary vector, not the only vector, but the primary vector was SolarWinds, which developed a software program called Orion, which was a network management tool. Orion was a very smart target. It was used by over 18,000 organizations, including a large majority, 425 of US Fortune 500 companies, and 12 US federal government agencies. That's pretty expansive. It was a very rich target for them to focus on. And so when I say that only over 100 were done, that was a small fraction. Yeah, you could have had 18,000 different organizations that could have actually been exploited. The way they did it was they actually infected the Orion software at the build level. They installed a backdoor. That backdoor was unknown to SolarWinds programmers. SolarWinds then deployed the compromised software to its customers as an update, a seemingly small update. And then later, the operators used the Orion backdoor to gain greater access. And we'll walk through that in just a second, how they did that. This is a helpful chart, I think, to give you a view, sort of a graphical view of how it worked. You'll see the 4 steps to the design or the software development process: system design, implementation, iterative testing, and finally deployment. And what happened in SolarWinds and Sunburst is they actually injected themselves into the system design process really early on. And when you can get in that early, the nice thing about that, or the benefit, is that it will probably carry all the way through to deployment. And if they can't figure it out, and they likely wouldn't because it's back in the build level, it will continue to update and never close that potential gap, that security flaw. And so really advantageous if you can get in this process. So how did Sunburst actually do it? Well, the first thing, as we talked about, they used a backdoor created in the Orion software to gain access. And Orion was a smaller company at the time, based out of, SolarWinds was a smaller company at the time based out of Austin. And so they didn't have quite the same amount of security as, say, a bigger company would. Then they would use that backdoor to gain access to the company network. Once in the company network, they would install malware to allow greater access. Now, here's the key, and this is the operational security. They would then actually cut off the Orion backdoor and stop using it. It's important because what they would actually see, if you would go back and look at systems logs, you'd actually see a lot of activity probably going through that backdoor. And so in order to prevent being discovered, they would stop using the Orion backdoor and use mainly the malware to be able to operate on the company network. The nice thing about that is, in the event they shut off the malware, got rid of the malware, and closed those potential flaws, they could go back to the original Orion backdoor and use it again to do the exact same thing. Once inside the company network, through the backdoors and through the malware, they then exploited flaws in trust relationships, so things, security certificates. in the Microsoft Identity and Access Management products to gain credentials and bypass multi-factor authentication. This allowed them to move laterally between on-premises networks to then cloud environments, think Office 365. Once they were able to access Office 365 and the Azure is the Microsoft product they use to essentially authenticate people. Once they were able to get into that product, they were able to exfiltrate as many emails, gain certificates, and just get a tremendous amount of information. And so as you see, the whole process of what they're doing is they're getting in and they're just slowly adding additional sort of authority and power and getting access to that information. So what was the goal? Well, as I said before, it was largely an intelligence campaign, a large-scale exfiltration of sensitive data over the course of months. For example, you might have heard they gained access to the emails of the Department of Homeland Security Secretary and the cybersecurity staff, which ironically was responsible for hunting and detecting threats from foreign countries. So how much did they gather? We don't know. Given the nature and length of operation, probably a lot. If we can think about just the Sony hack as an example, they had a tremendous amount of emails they slowly and surely released over time and just showed how powerful some of those emails can be. Information was probably going to be used for strategic purposes. And some people might balk at that and ask, well, what kind of strategic purposes? Sometimes these are mundane emails that no one cares about. Well, think about it. I mean, if you can actually read the email deliberations of diplomatic activity, right? If you can see what's going on behind a government agency as they're coordinating with industry to create standards, or what about a contract that's upcoming for a Navy port of some sort? Each of these things allows you to get behind the curtain, behind the veil of what a company, what a country is doing, and allows you to potentially use that information to shape your behavior or to help shape their behavior. And so really powerful stuff, especially when you consider some of the different organizations they actually infiltrated. So what did we learn from this? Well, largely, a lot of the lessons learned come out of this wonderful article, a wonderful report done by the Atlantic Council, Broken Trust. It's online, it's available online. I encourage you to read it. It talks you through the entire process, what happened, and then ultimately a number of recommendations. But the three main lessons that we learned are, first, deficiencies in risk management. What they found was that the US government does a poor job of really identifying different targets that are rich, really, really good targets, for example, like the Orion software. And also they do a pretty bad job of understanding what metrics to measure when doing monitoring. We understand after the fact things that we could have done, but we haven't done a great job of really identifying the various metrics to look at when trying to detect potential infiltration. And so as a result, these two things are indicative of the fact that we have just not prioritized risk management. In fact, a recent audit found that only 5 of 23 federal agencies actually had compliant information and communications technology supply chain risk management processes. That means 18 of 23 do not. And in some of those cases, the processes have gaps. So earlier I mentioned Orion. What's important about Orion, not only was it accessible by 18,000 or used by 18,000 different companies, but it was actually on the DoD's information network approved list. As in, you could go on there and download it and not have to go through a lot of the hoops that you would normally have to go for unique software. Well, that's a great process. It's a very lengthy process. It requires extensive approval and testing. However, small minor updates don't undergo that approval process. And as a result, that's what happened with Orion. It was actually done through a small update, a minor update. So that's the first thing we've learned, is we've got to do better at identifying, at risk managing, identifying these various targets and being able to understand what metrics we have to measure. The second thing that we learned was that these cloud technologies are hard to defend. A lot of these cloud services have to rely on some kind of identification and account management software. As you heard, Microsoft uses Azure as well as Office 365 and Active Directory. All of these are ways to provide permissions and authentication, which you absolutely need. The problem, though, is because they're cloud-based and because they interact with so many other different softwares, they have become complex and as a result vulnerable. Now, oddly or ironically, because they become so complex and the rate of innovation is so high, there's interoperability concerns. And so as a result, many companies just don't want to potentially threaten or potentially lose the interoperability. So they instead decide to go with the defaults when it comes to security. And as a result, make it less secure. And so just by nature of what they are, these software, the nature of what the software is, they are inherently less secure than we would like them. And the other thing is some people might say, well, aren't there companies out there that do this? For example, Microsoft and Amazon, right? They actually do security and they will manage a higher or more secure environment. They will also help you with tracking down exactly what happened in case you were the victim of a hack. Well, Microsoft and Amazon both do that, but they charge you more for it. And so as a result, people are less inclined or companies are less inclined to do this as a result of the potential of having to cost more money, as well as it just becomes really complicated. And last but not least, limited speed and poor adaptability. As we talked about, that supply chain software process is a long process. It takes months. And so it's very difficult for us to make sure that the security policies are up to date with supply chain risk landscape. And so as they develop these things, they are behind the times when it comes to actually trying to identify the potential security issues that might exist. And so because of that, it's just another example of us where we need to prioritize some of these things. So that's basically how Sunburst worked and the lessons learned. I'll now turn it over to Professor Jeff Miller for the rest of the presentation.
All right, thank you very much, Colonel Goines. That was a really interesting discussion on the background. And so as we go through the provisions now of the executive order that was meant to address the Sunburst operation, I want you to keep in mind some of the things that Colonel Goines discussed, such as supply chain protection, software build vulnerabilities, trust networks, interagency coordination and standardization, or the lack thereof in this case, incident response standardization, detection and vulnerability assessments, and cloud computing. So these were all areas where you can see a direct correlation between what we saw in the Sunburst operation and the executive order. So with that, let's move on to the executive order 14028, improving the nation's cybersecurity. So what was the scope of this executive order? Well, again, primarily focused on federal government networks. Remember, Colonel Goines said executive orders have to address things within the scope of authority of the federal government. So something that is granted to the executive branch under the Constitution or an authority granted by the legislative branch. So the reality is that the federal government has fairly little control over computer networks outside the executive branch. And so we really see that in this executive order. But if you look at the policy that outlines this executive order, the very beginning of it, if you read through it, it talks a lot about how the federal government needs to lead the way. It needs to set the example in the things that it does. And this executive order is really meant to do this. And it really does set the tone, I think, for executive branch cybersecurity going forward, which is why we wanted to do this presentation. Now, the executive order primarily addresses what we call the federal civilian executive branch agencies, which are all of those agencies outside the DoD and the intelligence community. However, as we're going to see in just a moment, it has a lot of applicability to the DoD as well, and specifically Section 9. So we're going to start out with Section 9 as opposed to the earlier sections because it outlines why it's important to the DoD, and I know that most of our audience here today as part of the DoD. There are some exemptions that are possible based on mission requirements. I think the executive order demonstrates an understanding that sometimes DoD and IC requirements are going to be a little bit different from, say, Department of Energy, Department of State, or DHS, and so it does allow for some of those variations. But it does specifically call for changes in the DFARS, and we're going to address that why in a little bit here. Okay, one other thing to note, I did not include in this briefing the timelines. However, if you go back and look at it, you're going to see very strict timelines for when these need to be implemented in the federal government. And we're not talking years. You know, we are talking 30 days, 60 days, in some cases 120 days. But, you know, particularly for an executive order, the timelines are very quick, and I'm sure it's caused a lot of scrambling in a lot of different executive agencies in order to meet these timelines. So if you're interested in those exact timelines, please go back and look through the executive order. Just in the interest of time and space, I did not include them in this brief. All right, slide. Okay, so how is it organized? 11 different sections. We're going to focus on sections 2 through 9 because that's where the actual concrete policy requirements lie. However, helpfully, they did include a section on definitions, on general policy, but we're not going to really go into those today. We're going to focus on those actual concrete requirements. And as I said, we're going to start with section 9. And why is that? Because that's the one that addresses national security systems, which is where most of us in the DoD operate on, including the .mil domain and the different IC domains. So the DoD and the IC is mandated to adhere to the standards that are contained in the IO. It's just that, as I mentioned before, it included a clause that said such requirements may provide for exceptions in circumstances necessitated by unique mission needs. And much of the authority in here is given over to SecDef as the lead of the DoD and many of the IC agencies, including the NSA, as opposed to the individual agency chiefs outside the DoD and the IC. However, there are a lot of provisions in here that require the DoD to work together with CISA, with DHS, with some of the other agencies in order to make sure that our practices and standards are roughly equivalent across the different agencies. Slide. Okay, so section 2 begins with threat sharing. So, you know, this is one that's come up a lot over the years because oftentimes different agencies have different pieces of the puzzle, and the federal government has not always been very good at working together. And part of that is because many of our networks in the federal government are operated by private companies, not by the agencies themselves. And those private companies in the contracts did not often stipulate that they would be required to share information about intrusions upon their systems. And so this section seeks to remedy that by requiring, making changes in the FAR and the DFARs to remedy that lack of requirement. So from now on, any contracts granted for private companies to operate networks, including software systems, including support systems, must share any threat information or intrusion information with the rest of the federal government. So it will require collection and preservation of that threat incident data, as well as requirements to share and collaborate with other executive agencies. And the Secretary of Defense will be required to share their incident reports as well with those other agencies, which is something that was not happening regularly prior to this executive order. Slide. All right, section 3. So modernizing government cybersecurity. So despite the fact that the cloud computing in some ways, as Colonel Goines pointed out, acted as a vector for some of the Sunburst operation, the federal government is still doubling down on going towards secure cloud services. It's just there are fewer targets to defend in the cloud. Now, there is a downside to the cloud, right? If all of your data is aggregated in one location, you can better secure that location. However, if there is a breach into that, then the amount of data that can be gained is much greater than if the information is dispersed over a broader set of network servers or whatever. So there's downsides and upsides, but in this executive order, the federal government is doubling down on the secure cloud services. And perhaps more importantly, advancing towards what we call zero trust architecture. So with the establishment of the internet and through its development, trust has always been a very important part, as Colonel Goines pointed out. You have to establish that trust relationship between machines in order to share data or services. However, previously, we went from more of a posture of assuming trust unless there was something to indicate otherwise, right? Some sort of anomaly or some sort of identified threat, towards, and now we're moving towards an architecture that starts with an assumption of no trust. So I always assume that I do not trust the machine or some operator that I'm reaching out and discussing with, unless I have taken affirmative steps to establish that trust. So instead of starting with that assumption of trust, unless otherwise indicated, I'm now starting with an assumption of no trust until that's established. And that might make communications in some situations more difficult. However, it's most certainly a more secure type of environment to operate in, and that's what the executive order mandates, that we move towards that zero trust architecture, as well as a requirement for multi-factor authentication. So that's anytime, right, you log on and suddenly you get a thing on your phone that says you have to check your phone and put the code in. That's multi-factor authentication. So you're both putting in a password and authenticating through some other methodology. Also requirements for greater data encryption. And this is both for data in motion and for data at rest. So both of those are going to be required to be encrypted at all times in the federal government. And some of you may be familiar with the FedRAMP process. This is a process whereby companies can get their software approved to be used on secure government networks. However, a lot of software companies complained that the process for this was cumbersome, difficult, and there wasn't a lot of help for them to work through that process. And so the executive order is requiring modernization of that FedRAMP process. Next slide. All right, so Colonel Goines talked a lot about software supply chain security, and this is definitely a big part of the executive order. And really authority for this in terms to set the standards is now being given over to the National Institute of Standards and Technology. In many ways, this makes sense because this is kind of a core mission, but it hasn't been a mission of NIST when it comes to cybersecurity. So this is going to be a very new area for NIST to get involved in, and that's going to be, we're going to have a slide on challenges that comes up at the end, and this is going to be one of the major things that we addressed, is this new role for several agencies in the federal government, including NIST. But they've been tasked to work together with the different agencies, with academia, and with the private sector to set standards for supply chain security of software. Vendors are going to be required to certify the development and security standards of their products. And included in this is going to be what we call a software bill of materials requirement. So some of you may be familiar with the bill of materials. This is basically anytime a product is being developed, usually it's relying on many different subcontractors and parts. Just think of an airplane, right? Think of how many different companies contribute to that aircraft that's ultimately developed. Well, you need to have a bill of materials that says where each one of those materials came from. Sometimes they might come from sources that are prohibited. And so you need to make sure that you have that available. So this is going to be a requirement to do that with software. What a lot of people don't know is that software, when it's created, often uses various open source software and pre-made software from other places that are kind of cobbled together to create a new set of software. Well, when you do that, you don't always know what the vulnerabilities are of that software that you're incorporating into your new product. And this bill of materials is going to require that if you produce software for the federal government, you have to account for every part of that software, where it came from, and identify any potential vulnerabilities. So this will better make it known for users of that software what the potential vulnerabilities are and what they're using. It also includes some guidelines for Internet of Things. So a lot of you are familiar with Internet of Things. Maybe you have a refrigerator that's connected to the internet, or a number of other products in your home. And so much as when you buy a food product, you have a label on it that tells you different things about what that food product is. Maybe you want to know how much refined sugar is in it or whatever else goes into that food product. Same thing with the Internet of Things. So if you buy something that's going to connect in your home up to the internet, the labeling will tell you what the potential vulnerabilities are of using that product within your house are. Okay, next slide. All right, and a lot of you are familiar with the National Transportation Safety Board. If you saw the movie Sully, right? So when he lands the plane on the Hudson, he has to go through the NTSB investigation process, where they look at step by step everything that happened during that incident. both to figure out what happened and also, even more importantly, to make recommendations going forward. Well, they're going to establish something very similar to the NTSB, except for cyber, and they're going to call it the Cyber Safety Review Board. And their mandate will be to review and assess significant cyber incidents, such as the Sunburst operation. And this will happen anytime the Cyber Unified Coordination Group is triggered. So if you go back, if you have time, look at Presidential Policy Directive 41, PPD 41. And this is the PPD that establishes the National Cyber Incident Management. And so the primary group that gets set up under PPD 41 following cyber incidents is this Unified Coordination Group. And so they will have to work together with the Cyber Safety Review Board, again, to help understand what happened, but even more importantly, make recommendations going forward. And within the EO, they specifically directed that this review board look at the Sunburst operation to do assessment and recommendations. And the private sector is going to be required to be participatory in that, just as they would be under the NTSB. Okay, standardizing incident response. So again, going back, this lack of each agency does incident response differently. There was really no standard framework. And so CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency under DHS, has been tasked to develop a standardized framework under the EO that has to be updated annually and reviewed by the NSA to standardize incident response for major cyber incidents across the entire federal government. They're going to have to incorporate those NIST standards that we talked about, and they will be used by federal civilian agencies, non-DoD IC. The DoD has its own processes for doing this, so they're going to be separated out. Although the DoD is often involved in these PPD 41, particularly providing intelligence and threat information to the Unified Coordinating Group. Okay, next slide. Vulnerability and incident detection. So some of you may be familiar within the DoD, within Cyber Command, we have these cyber hunt units that they go out on DoD and IC networks, and they actually hunt for threats so that they can identify them and then rectify any of those threats. Well, there wasn't really a similar authority for non-DoD IC networks in the federal government. And so CISA has been given enhanced authorities to do a very similar mission to what these DoD cyber hunt units are doing. And they're going to be able to do that on all federal networks, again, non-DoD IC. And the agencies must provide CISA with the relevant data to the threat and vulnerability analysis to do this. Again, for national security system, DERNSA, as before, continues to have the lead on that. However, DoD and DHS are tasked to develop procedures for the sharing of incident response orders and directives. So oftentimes, the DoD was making good common sense updates or directives for their networks, but they weren't telling the rest of the federal agencies about those, and they could have really advantaged, or vice versa. And so now these two agencies are going to be required to share those orders and directives with each other to make sure that we all have the most up-to-date information in terms of incident response orders and directives. Slide. All right, investigation and remediation. Believe it or not, many agencies, when there are intrusions, are not keeping logs of the events. So basically, one of the only ways to go back and review what happened so that you can mitigate what happened and then make improvements going forward is by reviewing the network logs and what happened during the intrusion. However, if you do not keep those logs, then you cannot do that. And many agencies were not doing that. And so DHS is now being tasked to develop standards, and then those logs are going to be required to be kept by those different agencies, and they must turn them over to CISA or the FBI upon request. And the Office of Management and Budget will be tasked to enforce to make sure that these different agencies are doing this network event logging and retaining those logs in case intrusions are detected. Slide. All right, so what are some of the challenges in these different provisions? Those are there is quite a bit there. I know we were skipping over the wave tops in the interest of time. It's really a fairly thick document and gets down into a lot of specifics. So if this is something that interests you or is in your practice area, I definitely encourage you to go back and read it very carefully. However, there are definitely a lot of challenges coming out. So a lot of federal agencies are getting new roles, such as NIST, that they never had before. And that's going to be a real challenge because they're going to have to train up their workforce and really work together with a lot of different agencies in order to develop whatever it is that they're being required to do. Now, EOs make policy requirements, right? But they don't grant money. The legislature does that. And so there's a lot of requirements to do things in here. However, they need to be backed up by resourcing, and that has to come from Congress. So that's going to be a big challenge, at least initially, is getting Congress on board to resource all of these initiatives. Because I think most of them are good, common sense things that the federal government should be doing, but a lot of them are not resourced to do that. All right, obviously you might have, if you were watching this and you recently sat in a long gas line thinking about Colonial Pipeline, you're like, what about ransomware? There was no discussion of ransomware, and a lot of people had this question. And the reason is again, this was really a follow-on to the Sunburst operation. Colonial Pipeline did not happen. It was actually about contemporaneous with the release of this executive order. Obviously, ransomware now is getting a lot of attention after the Colonial Pipeline operation. And I do anticipate, and we are starting to see some things come out. Now, there's some interesting things about pipelines. The safety of pipelines is actually a TSA mission. TSA does not have a lot of expertise or tradition in the area of cybersecurity, but they are given the lead for security of pipelines. And so what I anticipate we'll see is a lot of changes in, they might come through executive orders or through other mechanisms in terms of cybersecurity over critical infrastructure following the Colonial Pipeline. But that was not the focus of this particular EO. And kind of dealing with cats and dogs, right? So it's much simpler in the DoD. Yes, we have different agencies. We have the Department of the Navy, we have the Air Force, we have the Department of the Army, we've got, you know, the intelligence community. However, the level of control that we have in the DoD and the IC over our networks is much greater than that which CISA does over the different .gov networks. It's starting to improve, it's starting to get better, but they're going to have a lot more challenges standardizing and maintaining these requirements over the different agencies that are part of the .gov network, as opposed to what Cyber Command /DISA /the NSA have over .mil and IC network. So that's going to be a real challenge, is just all the different federal agencies that are involved here. Okay, slide. All right, finally, because it came out recently, we wanted to also address another recent cybersecurity related executive order, 14034. This came out just earlier in June. And it's titled Protecting American Sensitive Data from Foreign Adversaries. A lot of you may be familiar with some of the ongoing struggles / litigation that the federal government had related to certain Chinese companies that were collecting a lot of data on US persons. Those included primarily TikTok and WeChat, although there were some others. And so the Trump administration, acting pursuant to a declared national emergency with respect to ICT and services supply chain, had made a lot of efforts and passed some issued some executive orders related to these particular companies. However, the Biden administration felt that the Trump administration had not necessarily been taking the correct approach on that, that perhaps some of what they were doing was not going to be upheld in the courts. And so what they chose to do was rescind all of those efforts against TikTok, WeChat, and those other companies, and basically start over again and do it in a different manner that they felt was going to be more productive and more, you know, to be blunt, legal at the end of the day. And so this executive order really was, with primary purpose was to withdraw those executive orders and then mandate that the Secretary of Commerce, in conjunction with state, defense, and other agencies, reevaluate these threats and make recommendations of how we should proceed going forward. So just a quick slide on that particular executive order. All right. And with that, we'd like to open it up to questions. Hopefully we left plenty of time. Yes, we did. Before we get into questions, just a quick reminder, you can see up there our email address, our website, You can find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Eventually, before too long, this one will also be up on YouTube. So please go back if you have interesting. We just did recently a webinar with Professor Mike Schmidt of the University of Reading and the Lieber Institute, who looked at malicious cyber operations against healthcare facilities during COVID. That one should be up shortly on YouTube, so you can go back and watch that one, as well as any of our other presentations. So I'll turn it back over to Lieutenant Goines to facilitate questions.
Great, Jeff, thanks. So we do have a question, one from Charlie Williamson, Mr. Williamson, who asks, and I think this one's for you, Jeff. Does the Cyber Review Board have any authority to accept privileged information under anything like what the DoD has for our safety boards, as compared to not having privileged or accident investigation boards?
That's a really good question. I could be wrong. I'd have to go back and look again. I don't think it got into that level of detail in the executive order. However, again, right now they're in the stage of developing how they're going to do this. So how they're going to build the safety review board out going forward. So I don't know that they're to that level of detail as of yet. I do know that there was requirements within the executive order for the sharing of data and the sharing of event logs with the safety review board, but I can't recall right now if there were provisions for privileged information, although I think that would be a very interesting concept to look at and evaluate, particularly for private companies as opposed to government agencies. So if you have a private company operating your network, obviously there's going to be some hesitancy there to share information that might bring liability on you for sharing that information. So if you could do something similar to the protections that you gave to, say, aircrew in an aircraft accident, that would be a very interesting concept. So I'll have to go back and look over the fine print and see if that was in there, but I don't recall it being in there. But again, that doesn't mean it won't be, because they're right now they're being tasked to develop this organization and how they're going to do that.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So as of right now, we don't have any other questions in the log. So I would encourage, if you have any questions, feel free to put one in there. We'll give it a couple of minutes just to give everyone a fair opportunity.
So not seeing anything right now, Tim. I'll go ahead and kind of provide a few closing comments and then turn it over to you if you had any. But the theme, and hopefully something you took away from this presentation, is that cybersecurity across the federal government was really not a standardized affair. And there was a great amount of lack of coordination and standardization. And although the federal government does not, as I mentioned before, have a lot of authority outside of the federal government for cybersecurity, I think it understands the need to kind of lead the way, be an example to the country. And so I think this executive order, which, by the way, a lot of these sorts of things don't have a lot of teeth behind them or don't have a lot of specifics. This one really does. It really has. So if this is an area of practice for you, I really do encourage you to read down into the fine print, because although we kind of skimmed across the wave tops for the purpose of this webinar and introducing what's in it, it's really interesting to get down into the details. But its primary effort is to start standardizing these practices across the federal government, and to make sure that each of these agencies is being accountable for that security, so that we can both improve the security of the federal government networks, but also act as kind of a proof of concept for state governments, local governments, private sector, in terms of some of the things that really work and some of the approaches, such as that zero trust architecture, such as the safety review boards. So these are all very important areas. And a lot of it, I think, is going to be really interesting to see where it goes, such as this Internet of Things labeling. A lot of the things that you're buying and putting in your houses or your workplace or whatever are not very secure. There's very little standards for the security of these items. So whereas your primary home network might be very secure, your fridge might not be secure at all. And that might be an easy vector for somebody to break into your home network and gain access to your machine. So things like the software bill of materials, the Internet of Things labeling, these are a lot of very forward-looking things that the federal government is looking at doing right now. So I think this is a really good step. I think it's a fantastic document. Is it perfect? No, and I'm sure they'll make adjustments as they go along. Are there significant challenges? As we pointed out, absolutely. But I think it demonstrates kind of a rehack for the federal government on how we're going to do cybersecurity going forward. So I think it's a really important document. I'll turn it over to you for any final thoughts, Colonel Goines.
Yeah, Jeff, I agree. Particularly when you looked at us, year and a half ago, we were sort of focused on the hardware supply chain, really focused on making sure that we didn't have some vulnerabilities there. It's good to start turning our attention towards the software supply chain as well. And so I completely agree. That's expensive. Cybersecurity is a very expensive process for the private industry. So if we, the government, can serve as a proof of concept, can serve as a beta tester, if you will, we can show them how you can do it responsibly and affordably, and we can start to make some efficiencies within that process. So I completely agree. I think this is just a great step in the right direction. So if any other questions, I think we'll sign off from here. Thank you.